Hello, the Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files here. Now, I had promised that the green screen would be incoming, and it is indeed come in, actually. That is the good news. Now, the problem is that I used Zoom for one last time before switching to a different video software for recording, and I now have a better understanding of why it was the last time, because in my case it just crashed. And I was able to save the audio, but regretfully I was not able to save the video. So please go into the video in mind that you'll hear a fantastic interview. It's just that you're simply not going to see either one of us talking. Now, please come in and please enjoy what is, in my opinion, a fantastic watch of an interview. Hello, the Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. I am here speaking today to Dimitri Lascaris. He is a lawyer, activist. He was a candidate in the 2020 Green Party federal leadership race, coming in a very close second. Dimitri, thank you for speaking with the Canada Files.
Thank you for having me on. I say hello to your audience, and I hope you're doing well, Aidan.
Thank you, Dimitri. Now, brought you on here to speak about a rather disturbing piece of legislation that has just come up. It's Bill C-9. This is a act that is supposedly meant to combat hate propaganda, hate crimes, and restrictions and oppression against access to religious or cultural places. So, Dimitri, now this legislation, of course, as the liberals always like to do, it sounds noble. But who really would want this bill before we get into the details of what this bill is, actually?
The Zionist lobby would want this bill. So would supporters of the Ukrainian proxy war. They would want to shut down anybody who engages in certain forms of peaceful protest. So let me just give you a quick example, and we can get into this some more. This bill criminalizes the display of certain symbols, one of which is the swastika. Imagine that somebody decided to protest Canada's support for a Ukrainian regime that is infested with neo-Nazis. And in fact, the Mabel just reported that recently the Canadian embassy in Ukraine hosted a leader of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, which, despite all of its whitewashing, does remain a neo-Nazi organization. So if you were to go to a protest against the NATO proxy war, and you displayed a swastika for the purpose not of promoting Nazism, but of highlighting the fact that Canada is supporting neo-Nazi elements within Ukraine, you could go to jail for years. Let's suppose that another related piece of news, Politico just obtained a bunch of leaks of text from leading young Republicans, and they found texts in which they were praising Hitler and calling for their political opponents to be sent to the gas chambers and all kinds of other heinous nonsense. So let's suppose you decided to claim by using a placard with a swastika on it that Donald Trump is a Nazi or that the Republicans are Nazis. Now, you might want to disagree with that, but given what we know about the Trump regime, that would certainly be a position that should be protected by free speech laws. But instead, you could go to jail by sticking a Nazi on the chest of Donald Trump in some, protest placard. So again, and you could say the same thing if you displayed a Nazi, the swastika, beside a picture of Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, who really, by any rational measure, do behave like Nazis. These two most extreme members of Netanyahu's criminal regime. The only difference between them and the Nazis, as far as I can tell, is the ethnicity of their victims. Whereas the Nazis targeted Jews primarily and others, they are targeting Arabs and particularly Palestinians. So why shouldn't you be able to display the swastika if the point in doing so is to highlight the fact that there are people within the Israeli government who are behaving like Nazis? So this is just one example. And we can get into a number of other problems. I just highlighted one small problem, okay? Since we're on the subject, I'm on the subject of symbols. Most countries in this world don't regard Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Under this legislation, if you display the flag of Hezbollah as an act of protest against Canada's decision to designate it as a terrorist organization, you'll go to jail for years. These are simply forms of expression, and what the government focuses on as you've touched upon, Aidan, in your opening remarks, when it promotes censorious legislation like this that eviscerates our civil liberties, it highlights on it focuses on the examples of hateful conduct that we all agree, or most of us at least agree, is hateful. But they don't talk about the ways in which this law or these laws can be applied to stifle legitimate speech in the most really oppressive manner possible by sending people away to jail for years. And so I think this is a real dangerous step in the development of censorship and the repression of free speech in this country. And it's just part and parcel of a larger tendency that we see amongst this government that is raising military spending to 5% of GDP, that is aligning itself ever more closely with the Trump regime, despite its rhetoric. Mark Carney just hired another 1,000 border security officials and raised their pay at the same time as he's going to be forced by his own decision to raise military spending to 5% of GDP to slash social programs. Mark Carney is obsessed with the Ukraine war. He's giving even more billions to this Ukrainian regime, even though any rational observer can see that this war is destroying Ukraine and that it's going to result in Ukraine's strategic defeat. This is all part and parcel of a man who has devoted his entire life to militarism, to the neoliberalism, to the oligarchy. He himself is a member of that elite, which is, by the way, the reason that I constantly call him Prime Minister Goldman Sachs. That's who he is. And this is just another example of it. This man is actually much worse. When you look at his whole record so far, I'd go so far as to say he's much worse than Stephen Harper.
Well, it's certainly looking like a horrific start from Carney, to put it lightly. Now, I want to get into some of the details of the legislation. Now, there's an article from all places, the National Post, but it was a good one. Now, one of the alarming parts was that provincial attorneys generals used to have to consent to hate propaganda charges. Now, in one sense, this was restrictive because if you have, say, support for Israel's genocide, you could easily have these attorney generals blocking this on, because they're Zionists. It's harder to go after them, to pressure them. However, what do you think about that? Now, the police actually can file these hate crimes charges. Where do you think the risk is here?
Well, we know that there are many people within the police, for example, who are deeply sympathetic to Israel. Police forces around the country have, in fact, trained with Israeli security forces and officials. I think it is extraordinarily dangerous to the Palestinian Solidarity Movement that we are expanding the powers of the police to decide whether or not these draconian penalties should be pursued against people who are condemning Israel's genocide. It is not by any means, by the way, an ironclad protection for free speech that we require the Attorney General to consent to a prosecution because they too are obviously pro-Israel. They are pro, Ukrainian proxy war and so forth. They have their own political biases, but the more you empower the police to apply these draconian laws to legitimate forms of protest, the more often they are going to be used to do just that. So, to me, this is a troublesome aspect of the legislation, but it's not the most troublesome. The most troublesome is the application of severe criminal penalties, including in some cases up to life imprisonment for legitimate forms of expression and dissent.
Right. So what I had seen so far is in terms of this new hate crime offense, that it could carry up to life in prison. But Dimitri, what specific offense are you referring to in this case? Can you go from there?
Well, so for example, there's a provision in this legislation which criminalizes blocking access to religious institutions. So you don't have to commit an act of violence. If in any way you are disrupting, impeding, even without hurting anybody, access to a religious site or institution, you could go to jail for years. Okay. Now we know because it happened very recently in Canada and the United States. I'm sure it's happened also in Western Europe, that people who were marketing land stolen from Palestinians, which is a war crime, occupied land being stolen by vicious force from Palestinians. They were marketing this to people in North America, Canada, and the United States. They were doing this from time to time in synagogues. The people who were actually holding these events were complicit in war crimes. If anybody's going to be prosecuted for a criminal offense, it should be them. But under this legislation, if you show up at that synagogue and you protest peacefully, but somebody can make a case that you were impeding access to the synagogue while this shameful event is being held, you could go to jail for years. And to give you another example, let's imagine a church, a so-called church, which the government recognizes as a religious site, where some Islamophobic pastor, an extreme Christian evangelical pastor, is regularly spewing anti-Islam hatred and inciting hatred towards Muslims. Okay. And people say, this is unacceptable. We're going to go stand outside this so-called church and we're going to protest against the hate speech that's being disseminated inside. And the police, and by the way, this happens all the time in this country, every day, Aiden, every day. I see people who are not only free to express their anti-Muslim hatred, but who in fact have large platforms. They have columns in national newspapers. They appear on major television networks in Canada. I see them spewing outright, undeniable anti-Muslim hatred, and nobody is prosecuting them. In fact, they're being paid handsomely for it. Okay, so we can't rely upon the police to prosecute these anti-Islam hate mongers. And it's easily imaginable that some pastor in some extreme Christian evangelical church would use the pulpit to spread hatred to Muslims. We can't go there now and protest peacefully for fear that we might be accused of impeding access to a religious site and sent away to jail for years. That's outrageous. It's outrageous.
It is for sure. Now, I want to look at the text of the legislation a little more closely. It's around Section 319 of the Act, and they add a definition of hatred. I want to read this to you, Dimitri. Hatred means the emotion that involves detestation or vilification, and that is stronger than disdain or dislike. Am I the only one that looks at that and says that is such an incredibly low barrier when you see horrific genocide that Israel has, escalated since 2023? How could you not, hate Zionism? And should anybody who demonstrates that vocally, should they just be thrown in jail in Mark Carney's Canada?
Well, wisely, the Supreme Court of Canada, in a seminal case called Keegstra, decided many years ago, um, for purposes of the criminal law, it interpreted hatred as the quote, most extreme manifestation of detestation and vilification. So only the outliers, the people who are off the charts in terms of their hostility, their expressed hostility towards vulnerable groups, were deemed by the Supreme Court of Canada to be fit for criminal prosecution. So this is a major, major lowering of that bar. Okay. Anything that's more than disdain, I mean, so what if I feel contempt? You know, I don't hate the person, but I feel contempt for them because they are spewing their own hatred towards vulnerable groups, or because, they're advocating for policies that are profoundly anti-democratic or that are, going to impoverish a large segment of the population. And I feel very, very strongly about that. And somebody can make a case that it's more than disdain. I could now find myself in jail. I mean, this is absolutely outrageous. So this is a tremendous lowering of the bar that the Supreme Court of Canada wisely set very, very high. And again, I think actually this is probably the most alarming aspect of this legislation.
Right. Now, I want to talk about the inspiration. Do you think that the inspiration of this sort of legislation is that which has been pushed in the United Kingdom?
Well, Mark Carney, as um, somebody argued very persuasively in an article published by Yahoo, you sent it to me, and I had the opportunity to read it. I recommend that people do read this article by Christine Van Gain. And actually, I think it might have been published in the National Post, which is remarkable. But in any event, no, it looks like Yahoo News. Um, she points out that Mark Carney, after having been the governor of the Bank of England, has adopted many customs and traditions since ascending to the role of prime minister in this country, which are borrowed from Britain. Kind of superficial trappings of formality and so forth, but it's just an overall tenor of his prime ministership up until now suggests that he is a big, big fan of British traditions. And Britain has one of the most repressive anti-terror laws in the world, frankly, not just in the West. In Britain, you can go to jail for 14 years for expressing support for a group that the British government has designated as a terrorist organization, whether or not there's any justification for it whatsoever. So the most blatant example or egregious example of this is the British government's designation of Palestine Action as a terrorist organization because it is engaged in civil disobedience and in some cases, uh, really very modest property damage against corporations, manufacturing facilities, most notably that of Elbit, the murderous Israeli drone manufacturer that has facilities in Britain. They engaged in what was very modest property damage. They didn't harm anybody. They didn't set the building on fire. That was the most aggressive thing that they did. Okay. And they have been designated as a terrorist organization under British law. If you express support for Palestine Action because you're opposed to the genocide and you see the British government continues to send weapons and provide intelligence to Israel despite the ongoing genocide, and you say we have to escalate because the British government is not responding to our, uh, you know, uh, obedient, peaceful demands for cutting off Israel, if you're one of those people, you could go to jail for 14 years. And the British government has, in fact, arrested hundreds of people, many of them elderly pensioners, who peacefully protested against the designation of Palestine Action as a terrorist organization and is threatening to prosecute them and send them to jail. And all they're doing, they haven't harmed anybody. Not one individual has been harmed by any of these people or by Palestine Action. Not one has been wounded, sent to hospital, nothing like that. Nobody's been beaten up. But the British government, in an attempt to stifle all dissent against its pro-Israel policies, has designated it as a terrorist organization, and now all of these people are subjected to long-term prison sentences. Is Mark Carney inspired by that? I think absolutely he's inspired by that. This legislation is strong evidence that he's inspired by that, and I can't imagine that other Western countries aren't going to soon follow suit. Canada is just going to follow the lead of Britain as it has done throughout its history, frankly.
Now, to give you an idea of how far things have gone in the UK, actually, you can get these recordings of no, quote unquote non-crime hate incidents. So you don't even have to have committed a crime. Now, this UK is going further and further and further, and look, with Carney's history, well, if this doesn't get fought now, it's only going to get worse. But you spoke about the terrorism front, the quote unquote terrorism front, let's be clear. Now, in this bill, all right, it talks about the promotion of these symbols that are associated with or principally used by a listed entity. Now, a listed entity includes the Ansar Allah. It includes the IRGC, forces that are critical in the fight against Israel's genocide. So I just want to circle back to it. This impact, what do you think the impact of this legislation is really going to be on activists overall? But let's be real here, the pro-Palestine liberation movement, I think, is going to be the first target.
It's already been targeted, of course. They designated Samidoun as a terrorist organization. The prison, this Palestinian Prisoners Solidarity Network. So this is a harbinger of things to come for sure. Sami Dune has not. No one alleges that Sami Dune has been engaging in property destruction in Canada or anywhere else. No one alleges, let alone can substantiate a claim that Sami Dune has threatened any Canadian with violence, committed any acts of violence, conspired to commit acts of violence. Okay. And yet they have designated Sami Dune as a terrorist organization without any due process. Let's be very clear about this. This is what this terror designation system, which some, there's an international, the name of it escapes me, a reputable international coalition of lawyers who protect civil liberties. They have argued, and I completely agree with them, that we should just get rid of the terrorist designations altogether. Okay, we already have laws which are designed to punish people, in some cases severely, when they commit acts of violence against others. We already have laws that protect property from destruction. We already have criminal laws that all of these criminal laws are, accompanied by stiff penalties in appropriate cases against threats of violence, conspiracies to commit violence. The only reason why we enacted these terrorist designations was to expand the government's powers to deter people from engaging in forms of disobedience that the government doesn't like for political reasons. So, for example, resistance to Israel's genocide in Gaza, and to do so, to empower the government to do so in a way that completely eliminates any meaningful due process. So before they designated Sami Dune as a terrorist organization, you would think in a society that's committed to due process, there would have been a trial, right? They would have charged, they would have brought some kind of application in a court of law, and the government would have been required to satisfy a judge with proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Sami Dune was engaging or threatening to engage in activities that meet the definition, the criminal code definition of terrorism. They didn't have to do that. They just said, without any due process, without any trial, without any real judicial scrutiny, they just said, we're going to designate it as a terrorist organization. And so now anybody who, takes the Sami Dune flag to a protest and says, under this law, right, the Sami Dune flag to a protest, because they want to say, I stand in solidarity with these people who are doing nothing other than defending the thousands of Palestinians who are being held without charge or trial in conditions amounting to torture. I want to express my solidarity with Sami Dune, who defends those people by waving the Sami Dune flag. You can go to jail for years now under this legislation. So, I mean, so you're already talking about a terrorist designation regime, which is, it just makes a mockery of due process. And now they're layering on top of that, um, additional criminal offenses for people who use symbols to express their support for these organizations, like Sami Dune. Or like, any of the Palestinian resistance groups, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Well, that's not yet designated as a terrorist organization in Canada, but the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine it's a secular left-leaning organization which advocates that Palestinians have a right to armed resistance and uses armed resistance. You can't, use symbols to express your support for them. And even if you just say something now under this legislation, you might to express support for any of these resistance groups, you could be sent to jail. And I just want to highlight here the unbelievable hypocrisy of this, Aiden. Okay, the unbelievable hypocrisy of this. Canada has allied itself in every imaginable way with the two worst terrorist actors on God's green earth, which are the governments of the United States and Israel. Okay, if you take the conventional mainstream definition of terrorism in the West, which is violence or threats of violence against persons or property that are motivated by an ideological, religious, or political objective, and you apply that to the conduct of Israel and the United States, the only rational conclusion you can come to is that they are the two worst terrorist actors on the planet. And our government is and always has been closely allied with them. And they're going to throw people in jail. They should be in jail. They should be in jail. Mark Carney's a war criminal. Okay. He's allowing weapons to be sent deadly weapons to be sent to Israel as it carries out a genocide. Justin Trudeau is a war criminal. Anita Anand is a war criminal. All these people are aiding and abetting a genocide. Okay. And they're going to throw us in jail on some spurious allegation that we are engaged in or are promoting what they call terrorism. This is outrageous. It's beyond outrageous.
Thank you, Dimitri. Now, there's other draconian legislation that looks on the way in Canada, but we don't want to burden the audience too much in just one show. So, what message would you want to leave the Canada audience with about Bill C-9 specifically?
I mean, look, it's not going to be easy to stop this legislation, okay? But if enough of us put pressure on our elected representatives, and the people we really need to focus on here are, I mean, I don't think you're going to get too much traction with conservatives, although if you can find, conservative MPs who do actually care about civil liberties, and there are probably some, maybe you'll be able to persuade them. But I think the people you really have to focus here are people in the backbenches of the Liberal Party, the NDP, the Greens only have one person, people in the Bloc Québécois, and highlight for them, call up your MP, send them letters, sign petitions, go to their offices and tell them that this is a serious threat to legitimate free speech and the right to peaceful protest and to freedom of association. And they have to stop this legislation. The good news is the government is a minority government. Okay. So there is some possibility we can stop this legislation, but that is going to take massive amount of mobilization. And I guarantee you, my friends, that if they get away with passing this law, they will continue down this path. And we're going to end up becoming like Britain is today, or even worse. And you're going to see journalists being arrested, as Britain has done. You're going to see journalists having their phones seized, their laptops seized without their consent, even though they're not charged or convicted of any criminal offense. You're going to see people sent to jail, elderly people who are simply expressing opposition to a genocide. That's the path we're heading down. And I cannot urge people who are listening to this audience strongly enough to put all the pressure you can on your elected representatives to reject this draconian, authoritarian, anti-democratic legislation.
All right, Dimitri, thank you very much for speaking with the Canada Files. Now, to the Canada Files audience, if you appreciate this journalism and analysis, please do consider setting up a monthly or annual donation to support the work. And Dimitri, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you. Take care, Aiden.
Goodbye, everyone.